My mother, Sarah, was 27 years old when she decided to throw her only child, me, over a barbed wire fence. It was probably the most difficult, the most heart-wrenching decision that she had to make in her whole life. At the time, I was 4 months old. I was born in a small town called Piotrków in Poland. I don't know the date I was born. It depends on what document you really want to believe. My birth certificate says June 17, 1942, but by the time I got my passport, it had changed. I also found documents stating 3 other birthdays. So which one do I celebrate? None of them. I hardly remember anything from the Holocaust at all. But I've done lots of research by going into archives, reading books, talking to people, and the internet has been a fantastic source of information. I was born Yidile Henechovich. My parents were Sarah and David. They had high hopes for a life together. They dated for a long time before they married in 1939. 3 days before Germany invaded Poland. World War II started in September 1939 when Germany attacked and conquered Poland. We Jews were quickly isolated from the rest of the community and forced to move into ghettos, which were the poorest and the most run-down parts of town. The non-Jews who had been living there were given the better homes of the Jews that were evicted. Barbed wire fencing surrounded the ghetto. Restrictions were imposed on the Jews. Jews were shot for disobeying the Germans or for no reasons at all. Women were shot for appearing to be pregnant. When my mother discovered that she was pregnant with me, my parents decided that they should go into hiding. That is why I was born in a bunker. It was a dark underground cellar. I was among the 50 women and children that were in that cellar. I was one of the youngest ones. My father was not with us, and he tried to help us by smuggling food to us. As babies do, I often cried. The people in the bunker were concerned for their own safety, and they wanted to strangle me. My mother wouldn't let go of me, and eventually I stopped crying. The mass deportations of the Polish Jews to concentration camps began in January 1942. In Piotrków, they started in October 1942. At that time, there were about 20,000 Jews in Piotrków, and of those, 18,000 were put into cattle cars on their journey to the Treblinka extermination camp. Families were separated, lives were destroyed, among them most of my extended family. The only people who were allowed to stay in Piotrków were those that were working for the Germans in Piotrków, the ones in the glass factory, and like my 2 uncles, my grandfather, female cousin of mine, and my father in a woodworking factory. Sometimes the transports would last for days. The conditions in the jam-packed cattle cars were such that you couldn't sit or lie down. You had to stand all the time. There was no food, no water, very little air or light, and there was a bucket in the corner to be used as a toilet, if you could get to it. It was soon overflowing, and I can just imagine the stench that was in that cattle car. My mother and I were still hiding when these transports happened. We, in the bunker, were tricked by a Jew walking around the ghetto saying that he had water and food for us, and it was safe to come out. We were ordered together in a square. I was 4 months old. All my mother's efforts of surviving had come to naught. She must have felt utterly lonely by herself. Would she ever see her husband or her family again? My mother was carrying me in her arms as we were walking towards the square. She scanned the crowd and noticed that my father was on the other side of the barbed wire fence that separated the ghetto from the town. He had just finished his factory shift and was returning home. They made eye contact. What do I do? Do I go with the crowd and hope for safety in numbers? Surely they cannot kill us all. Can I believe the Nazis when they say that we're being transported to labor camps in the East? Then why are they shooting us in the street? Do I take the advice of our rabbi and be easy to deal with? Will that help? Babies cannot work. If I throw Yedela to you, can you catch him? Can you take care of him? What's the right decision? I'm frantic. I cannot think straight. What should I do? My mother had to make an immediate decision. She threw me over the barbed wire fence to my father and continued walking with tears rolling down her cheeks. Instinctively, she did not want me on this journey, and here was a small chance to save my life. Perhaps it gave her comfort to hope that I was safe with my father on her journey to Treblinka and the gas chambers. I don't know if I could do what my mother did. She died in the gas chambers within hours of arriving in Treblinka.
Did you ever go to the Treblinka memorial site later in life?
Yes, I did. Years later, I visited Treblinka. And it is customary for Jews, when they visit a cemetery, to leave a stone there. And I left a piece of stone that had been touched by my daughter and granddaughter. And I picked up this stone to remember my mother of what she did on that day that she threw me over the fence. And it will remind me of her all this time. Treblinka was a very strange experience for me. When I was there, it was very, very quiet. No birds were singing. And as I walked among the 200 stones that are there to symbolize the different cities and towns that were completely eradicated of Jews, it was a silence that was agonizing. The cries of ghosts. I listened to my mother's voice so that I could thank her for throwing me over the barbed wire fence. But her despair, drowned by the cries of all the million people that were killed there. My father caught me and realized that there was a guard that had noticed that he had me. And he went into a nearby house and hid me under some loose straw in the attic. The guard followed him and came and searched for me. He even poked the straw with bayonets and sticks. But fortunately, he didn't poke where I was. Apparently, I didn't make a sound. After the guard left, my father came and picked me up. To his great relief, I was unharmed. In 1940, two Germans, Fischer and Dietrich, motivated by greed and their fear of military service, took possession of a wood factory in Piotrków. They produced plywood frames and fuel for transportation. In their cover-up operation, they employed about 1,000 people, both Jewish and Polish. The Nazis demanded substantial bribes in the form of jewelry, services, and money. They were cruel and domineering. The labor camp was guarded by collaborators. The kitchen provided a ration of soup, and additional food could be bought from the local population. This was the camp my grandfather, my two uncles, my father, his female cousin, and I were assigned to. And this way, we avoided the deportation to Treblinka. The adults shared the burden of taking care of me. Our private space consisted of the area around our bunks. We lived in this labor camp for 2 years. Inadequate food, no privacy, virtually nowhere to wash, no medical attention, abusive guards. Yet some people organized entertainment to keep our spirits up. Sundays were special because we didn't have to work. By the fall of 1944, the German fortunes in the war had changed dramatically. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and the Soviet Union was advancing towards Germany. The Nazis did not want to leave evidence of how they had treated Jews in Poland, so we were ordered to march to a nearby railway station, where cattle cars were waiting to take us away. We were crammed with 350 others into cattle cars and were sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp. Although I was 2.5 years old, my father wanted me to appear older, with a chance of me being able to work. Thus, my registration form to Buchenwald stated that I was born May 10th, 1941. That is my second documented birthday. I became the youngest ever prisoner of Buchenwald.
Did you visit any other memorial sites in the process of conducting your research?
Yes, I did. I went to Bergen-Belsen and I went to Buchenwald as well. In Buchenwald, I found one of the exhibits at the museum there of the list of people that were sent from Piotrków to Buchenwald. And my number was on that list, 87874. And when I was in Buchenwald, I looked at the vast parade ground where at times there were 40,000 prisoners standing there for hours. And they weren't allowed to move. They had to stand there, whether it was raining or heat. The Buchenwald site was also used as a slave labor camp, and they were working in ornament factories that were close by, and also in the limestone quarry. And that was probably the worst job because they were hauling rocks uphill without any machinery at all. I was 2.5 years old at that point, so I didn't need to work. Within a couple of days of our arrival, my two uncles and grandfather were sent to a different camp. I stayed with my father. In the block next to ours were Danish police prisoners. Their conditions were somewhat better than ours because they were allowed to receive Red Cross parcels. And they generously shared that with us. So even under these horrible conditions, there was humanity, there was willingness to help each other. In Buchenwald, our life expectancy was very short because of malnutrition, lack of medical care, unhygienic conditions, treatment received from brutal guards, torture, and intentional killings. Some prisoners committed suicide by running into the surrounding barbed wire fence that was electrified. In January 1945, about a month after our arrival in Buchenwald, I was among the 21 boys sent to Bergen-Belsen. My father was held in Buchenwald.
You were very young when all of this happened, a baby and a toddler. Do you have any memories whatsoever of this time?
Yes, I do. I've had this nagging memory of being in an open cattle car. The people that I talked to said that no, it wasn't an open cattle car, that all the transports happened in a closed cattle car. But I did discover that from Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen, it was in a passenger train, the transport. It didn't make sense to me that a passenger train would come to a concentration camp and pick up 21 young boys that were in bad shape already, and at the same time expose the German population to the existence of concentration camps. So I asked the curator and the archivist at Buchenwald, did that really happen? And he said, no, that the train did not start in Buchenwald. It started in Weimar, which was 8 kilometers away from Buchenwald. 8 kilometers. How did I get to Weimar? And he sort of looked at me and said, it was in an open cattle car. And that really confirmed to me that what I remembered actually happened. And it's odd to me that, considering all the things I experienced, all the things I saw, that the only thing that would stick in my mind would be the open cattle car. And I tried to sort of find out, why is that? And the only reason that I can think of is that it was the last time I saw my father. And that separation from my father must have been really traumatic for both him and for me. But I don't remember him. I only remember the open cattle car. That's how I've retained that memory. Why were we chosen to go on that transport? Now, there are two possible explanations, at least. One is that the Nazis wanted to appear to be saving some children, and they wanted to send them to Bergen-Belsen because there was it was considered a recuperation camp. So that is one possibility, and that they wanted to gain brownie points doing that. The other possibility, and this is what the communists after the war suggested, was that the communists in the camp in Buchenwald were very influential, and they pressured the Nazis to send some children to a kinderheim that they knew through the underground that existed in Bergen-Belsen, and that they would that way save some children. In Bergen-Belsen, tens of thousands suffered physically from TB and from typhus and from malnutrition, unhygienic conditions. And this was where Anne Frank died. She has a marker there, but she's not buried there. She's buried in one of the mass graves. There was a children's home there. How did that happen? In November 1944, two remarkable young women prisoners, aged 25, Hermina and Luba, were chosen by Dr. Mengele to go as nurses from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. One night, these two women heard children crying. They found about 50 Dutch children outside their hut who had been abandoned there. They took them in and started caring for them. They found food by stealing, trading, and begging. Other women, teenage girls actually, joined them. They even had some guards helping them. By the time I arrived in January 1945, they had about 100 young children of different nationalities under their care. Block 211 became the Kinderheim, the children's home. In Bergen-Belsen, there was no official procedure for killing children. By January 1945, the Nazis either didn't know what to do with us or expected us to die anyway, or they just decided to turn a blind eye. The camp commandant knew and allowed its existence. While death raged in the rest of the camp due to typhoid, TB, unhygienic conditions, and starvation, only 2 children died in the children's home. This was a remarkable achievement of care given by some very young women. Across the lane from Block 211 is now a mass grave of 2,500 people. As children, we played among these corpses.
Did you meet other survivors after the war?
One of the survivors that I have met was Luba, that I mentioned earlier. I met her through a contact in Sweden, and I visited her in 2002. She didn't remember me, but that's not really surprising. I was just one of the 100 children that she took care of. And she took care of mainly the Dutch children. I probably had very little to do with her, but I've also met other people from the camps and people that have been involved in my journey. I have always had a very strong reaction when I heard this lullaby. And it puzzled me as to why would I react that way? Why would I start crying when I heard it? And quite recently, I saw a documentary about Luba, and she was singing that lullaby.
Whose lives she had saved, and whose little souls she once comforted with a Jewish lullaby.
Auf dem Pripetschau brennt a Feuer in Stubi seis. Wie voll Tränen sind in die Heißes, wird ihr später verstehen.
So now I have my answer as to why and how I remember it. She probably sang it to keep us calm and to help us sleep. And this lullaby is probably my bridge to my unknown past that I really don't recall. I found this book by Hetty Verone. She was one of Luba's helpers in Bergen-Belsen. And we made contact 65 years after liberation. It was a very emotional event. She didn't believe that I had survived because I had TB at the time. And she now lives in Australia, and we've kept in contact since then. We talked endlessly and caught up on each other's lives. We have become very good friends since then. She told me to document everything that I knew and to talk about it and talk to schools, talk to universities, to anybody that would listen.
I'd like to hear more about the process of your research and some of the breakthroughs you made in discovering details about your own past.
Year 2010, 65 years after liberation, really became my year of discovery. Lots of things happened that year. The first thing that happened was I was invited to the celebration at Bergen-Belsen. I was very reluctant to go there. But there was a strange feeling that I had when I was there, and that was of being at home. I've always felt strange and out of place in places. But there with all the other survivors, I felt at home. And it was very comforting. I hadn't expected that. So that was one thing that happened then. The other thing that happened there that was that I wanted to find out if anybody remembered me. So I walked around with a bib saying where I'd been when, and a photograph of me. And as I was walking along, there was a man that came towards me, and he looked at my bib and he said, "I remember you." And that was Kobe. Kobe was from my hometown. He had been on the same transports that I had, from Piotrków to Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen. He was 7 years older than I was and had a fantastic memory. He told me many of the things that I found out, one of them being that on the train from Weimar to Bergen-Belsen, I had sat on a guard's knee, and he gave me sandwiches on white bread, which was really unusual for that time of year. And he also told me that because I was the youngest, people were very protective of me. And I became somewhat spoiled and was considered a mascot or a pet. And I was treated very differently than the other boys on that transport. On my way home from Bergen-Belsen in 2010, I also stopped in Berlin, where I'd agreed to meet with my cousin from Finland and her son. And on a whim, we went to the museum in Berlin and looked up to see if they had anything on my mother. I found a document that stated that my mother had been killed in Treblinka. The curious thing about this document was that it was signed by a person called Shalom Makori. And he said that he was my mother's brother. Now, the reason that that caught my attention was that his surname was very different than my mother's maiden name. So I asked my cousin's son, who was living in Israel at the time, when you go back to Israel, see if you can find Shalom Makori or his son, Yoram. And I remember that because 50 years before that, I had visited Israel and stayed with a family by that name. So the whole thing sort of didn't really make sense. But Michael went back to Israel and said that no, there was no Makoris in the telephone book there, but give me a couple of days. And then he got back to me and said, I found Yoram Makori in South Africa. He told me, Yoram told him that he had been on Facebook for 5 days, and that was how he found him. My suspicion is that if I had not found him then, I would not have tried again. But Yoram turned out to be a treasure trove of information. His father was my uncle, and his father and Yoram knew that we were related. I didn't, but he did. And the reason that he knew that was that when I had come to Israel 50 years before, he had agreed with my father that he would not try to take me away and not inform me that he was related to me in order for me to stay with the family. Also, Yoram had family photos, which his father had taken with him when he left Poland. So now I have photos of my parents, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and some other relatives. So it really was a very fortuitous event. Yoram also explained to me that his father had changed his name when he came to Palestine. so that he would sound more Israeli as opposed to old country. So that is why the name difference. Another coincidence that occurred that year was one evening when I was watching TV, and I was flipping through the channels and rather bored. And I came across a documentary that the British had shot in Bergen-Belsen. And that documentary showed this. That was me. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I had to immediately go and look for the photos of me when I was 4 years old. I sent copies of this to Hetty and to Kobe to make sure that I was right. And they confirmed it. So now I have pictures of me when I was 2.5 years old, getting my hair brushed. What are the odds of this happening? I'm interested in mathematics, so I was trying to figure that out. First of all, there were 60,000 people in Bergen-Belsen at that time. What are the chances of me being filmed? What are the chances of the documentary maker using this particular clip in their documentary? I mean, they had all sorts of footage because the British were using film for their own propaganda purposes and also for recording what was happening in Bergen-Belsen. And then what are the chances of me actually seeing this and recognizing myself? It just blows me away. The odds must be astronomical. But now I have film of me getting my hair brushed 4 days after liberation. Bergen-Belsen became a displaced persons camp, a DP camp after the war, and stayed that way for 5 years. My stay was only there a couple of months. A Dutch Red Cross nurse kept a scrapbook there. And afterwards, she gave that scrapbook to the Bergen-Belsen Museum. Among her collection was my displaced person registration card. And she also had test results from the TB tests that had been carried out. So I now have my DP card as well. The card was published in the catalog, in the Bergen-Belsen catalog. And on that same page as my card, in this catalog, was the registration card of a friend of mine here in Victoria that lived on the same block as I did. And I was just amazed when I saw that we were that close in Bergen-Belsen, and then years, decades afterwards, we ended up on the same block in Victoria. Serendipity? Who knows? Sweden had agreed to accept 9,000 refugees with a priority given to people that were sick and children. As a three-year-old with tuberculosis, I was among the first ones to be transferred to a Swedish hospital. Before surrendering the camp, the Nazis had destroyed all the records. So none of my records followed me to Sweden. The bureaucrats in Sweden realized that at some point I would need a birthday. So, depending on the documents that they invented, 2 more birthdays for me. Eventually settling on the one that is in my passport. That's what I have documents with. 5 different birthdays. I stayed in Sweden for a year to recover from TB. First in a hospital and then for a short time in an orphanage. The Swedish record keeping was extraordinary. 60 years later, when they sent me my hospital records, I could follow my temperature on a specific days and also the number of bowel movements I had on that day. I'll spare you the details. Before the Swedish authorities allowed me to be adopted, there was more red tape. They wanted to ensure that I was an orphan. An Orthodox Jewish lady from New York came to Sweden and wanted to take 20 orphans to be adopted in the States. The Swedish authorities agreed to include me, but my 2 uncles, who had survived the war, refused to give their permission. So the boat sailed to New York without me. Had the adoption gone through, I may have ended up as an Orthodox American Jew, or perhaps not. I was now 4 years old. A Finnish Jewish couple, Minna and Sam Maslovat, came to Sweden wanting to adopt a girl or 2. Was it my blonde curly hair, or when I clung to Minna saying in German, "Das ist meine Mama," this is my mother, that they had decided to adopt me. I moved to Finland, where I grew up. That was when my name changed to Julius Maslovat.
What was life like after liberation?
After that, my life changed considerably. I couldn't have asked for better parents. They were caring, patient, and provided me with everything I possibly could want. Then at 14, I went to England to a boarding school, a very good boarding school. Continued there and then became an engineer. In 1966, I emigrated to Canada, got married in 1967, had 2 children, and now I enjoy a life of retirement and doing more or less what I want to be doing. To me, my early childhood is really like a jigsaw puzzle in that there are pieces scattered all over the place. And it has been a very interesting journey of trying to find the pieces and putting them together and making a whole story out of it. There's one big piece that is still missing, and that is I don't know what happened to my father. I know that he was transferred from Buchenwald to Frankfurt am Main about a month after I left. But I don't know where or how he died. He could have died in Frankfurt am Main, or on the death march back to Buchenwald, or on a transport from Buchenwald to Bergen-Belsen. On that transport, out of the 200 people in the cattle car, only 8 survived. Nietzsche has said, if you have a why to live, you can find a way to live. It's possible that because he was taking care of me, that was his why to live. And after I had left, his desire for life was gone. So I may have extended his life a little bit, I don't know. I may never have the answer to my question of why did I survive? Perhaps it was my blonde hair. Perhaps it was just straightforward luck. But I know that I wouldn't have survived as a toddler and as a baby without help from other people. Whether it was the people in the labor camp in Piotrków, my relatives there, or whether it was my father in Buchenwald, the people definitely in Bergen-Belsen, Luba, Hermina, and Hetty, and tons of other people that I have no idea about. And those are the people that kept me alive. To me, they are all examples of how an ordinary person can become extraordinary. How one person can make a difference. But how can I thank my mother, who decided to throw me over the barbed wire fence against all her maternal instincts? Because she had an intuition that she did not want me on the journey that she was going. And that is obviously a big part of why I survived. I'm not sure that I could do that if I was in her position. And of course I owe a huge gratitude to my adopted parents, Minna and Sam Maslovat, who gave me a good life of security and comfort. They enabled me to overcome my trauma and all the things that I had suffered, and to grow up without bitterness and hatred.
You have often been to Germany. After having experienced all this in the hands of the Germans, having your parents killed and all the suffering you saw, how do you feel about the Germans today?
Well, although the Nazis killed my parents, they killed them only because they were Jews. If I hated Germans of today only because they're Germans, I would be no better than the Nazis. And to me, that would be an indication that they won the war of instilling hatred in me. I will not do that. So, because the Germans of today have no responsibility for what their parents or their grandparents did. To me, a person's religion or nationality or sexual orientation is completely irrelevant. Having received all this help, I feel that the only way I can show my gratitude is by talking about my experiences and helping people that are less fortunate than I am. As a Holocaust survivor, it is my duty to talk about it. There are very few of us left, and it has to be kept valid as long as possible. So I am involved with Holocaust studies, conferences, and I give talks in Canada, in the US, and Germany. So what can you do? Remember that World War II did not start with guns. It started with words, with bullying, and taking away people's rights. When you see that today, don't ignore it. Do something about it. Oppose it any way you can. Stop bullying, name-calling, laughing at racist or sexist jokes, or making fun of people because they look different than you do. Make friends with people that are different than you. Write letters when you see human rights being abused. Vote. Write articles. Don't be silent or indifferent when you see social injustices. Help people, whoever they are, whether they're children or whether they're adults. whether they're related to you or not. They are people just like you and me. To quote Albert Einstein, if I were to remain silent, I would be in complicity. Thank you for coming out and listening to me. Thank you for the questions that you had, and I hope that this session has been meaningful to you. Thank you very much.